Hi. We complete our journey through Revelation 18 today and the long passage in chapter 17 and 18 of God's judgment on Babylon. And as we do, stick around because at the end we're going to see there's a surprise twist here that brings together the first half of Revelation with the second part that we're on here in a surprising way for readers who are paying close attention. So we're picking up today with the shipmasters and seafarers, and I have the Hebrew Scriptures passages that are parallel on the right side to start with, because as we're going to see, John is taking this section and the remaining that we have here and basing it on the judgment against Tyre in Ezekiel 26 and 27, which I could bring up the whole passage, but you can find it for yourself. We only have one piece of it here, but if you were to look at the whole thing, you'd see that he's really building it there. So a number of the rare words that we see in this passage are taken directly from the Septuagint of Ezekiel. So let's look back at our structural issues here before we look in details. We're focusing now on the Seafarer's Lament, the C prime part, the B prime part, which is just one verse, the call to rejoice in the judgment, and the closing of the chiasm with A prime, with all the nations condemned with Babylon. And there's a lot going on there. So as we've been seeing all along, this is one option for structure. The other one is based on Catherine Maloney's parallel with Amos 5. So now we're in the announcement of the reason for the judgment at the end. It's parallel to what we see with Amos here at the very end. So let's look at that, and then we're going to see the surprise at the end. So we're starting here with the shipmasters and seafarers. And note, first of all the language that John uses here about people who work at the sea. We have 4 different terms here, and then there's even another one hidden, as we'll see. So we hear shipmasters here, Kubernetes, which is to say the ship captains. Seafarers here is literally all who sail to a place, so that's workers, but that's separate here from what's named as sailors, or the nautes, which is the rank and file. But then there's added all whose trade is on the sea, which is say everybody whose business is on the sea. But then down here, there's even another one, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, which is, say, the ship owners. They might not even be on the ship. Those could be rich Romans or Roman citizens who don't necessarily live in Rome, of course, who are contracting out with the shipmasters and all these other people to do the work for them, just like farming. So it could be what we think of as a capitalist, although capitalism isn't the proper term for what's going on there. So a lot of emphasis on this, and that's because the Roman Empire was utterly dependent on maritime commerce. As many scholars have noted, it was much cheaper until the invention of the railroad and the steam engine railroad in the 19th century especially, to travel along water. Hence, for example, in North America, the enormous labor and cost to build the Erie Canal, because when it was done, it was so much cheaper to move things around on barges on the water than across land on horses. Railroads, of course, known as an iron horse, replaced that. But that was a long way off. So back in our world, plying at sea was how you could take large quantities of things and bring them all over. So you could have merchants and you could have kings, but without the shipmasters, seafarers, sailors, and all whose business is on the sea, there would be no maritime empire. So all these together stand far off now. And then we see inserted here before the pattern that we saw from the kings and the merchants, where they were named, they stood far off, and they wept and mourned, or wept and wailed as the kings. Here we have this part inserted. They cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning, what city was like the great city. And notice this is the final example of this here, where although there's a her burning, they never name, what they name is never about her or a whore. What they name is the city. And they ask the rhetorical question here, what city was like the great city? City is only named here once in the Greek. But what was like the great city? And of course the answer to the rhetorical question is nothing. And then they throw dust on their heads, which is a ritual of mourning. We see it from another number of places, but plainly this is out of the Ezekiel 27 passage. When we look back at the Hebrew Scriptures here, you can see that throwing dust on their head is about this many parallels here in this verse, and I've showed you, and the bold, there are many of those here. So they threw dust on their head as a sign of their mourning, and wept and mourned, crying out, woe, woe, and they also have the woe, woe. And if you haven't watched the previous video, I'll just repeat here that the alas is ui, translated otherwise in chapter 8:13 as woe, which is the collapse of the great city itself. So we saw earlier how the 3 rows represented the 2 falls of Jerusalem and now the final fall of Babylon, and that's what we're hearing here, repeated by all the people who are suffering because they're no longer making profit on this. So alas, alas, the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. And interestingly, the people who grew richer wealth are not those who are crying out, "Whoa, whoa!" These people up here are not the ones who are making the big profit off it. Obviously, they're getting paid a salary or some kind of contract wage. But the big profit that's referred to here, those people aren't even present. We don't know where they are. The word for wealth is an unusual word for wealth there, timiotetus, different than plutos, which is the normal word for wealth. The analytic lexicon notes it implies an abundance of costly things. So plutos could be wealth in general, meaning like land, but this implies the pile of things, the cargo that was the lament of the merchants. From 1 hour laid waste, and here it's she's laid waste. So we saw the 1 hours earlier. I'll bring that up one more time because we have two of those here. The 1 hour that we looked at last time from the merchants, the wealth is laid waste, plutos there, but here Babylon itself laid waste. And so that leads us to a shocking switch here, and I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of our passage on the screen. After all that, suddenly out of nowhere comes this call to rejoice, and it's just one verse, and then it returns, and that's really highlighting the chiastic parallel here. Yet this is parallel to the call to come out of her, my people, and the reasons for that we saw earlier. So it reverts to that with this sudden call to rejoice in the midst of all the wailing and mourning. And that's really to highlight that anybody who's John's audience is being called to identify with these people, to not lament the fall of a city that was exploitative and violent, and we'll see a reference to that violence in verse 21 in a moment, but to rejoice because God has given judgment for you against her. O heaven, saints, apostles, and prophets. And this is the only time we hear saints, apostles, and prophets as one group. We've seen different combinations of those elsewhere, saints and prophets, apostles and prophets. Apostles is only a couple times, and we'll see it one more time here, apostles and prophets. But all three levels of how John understands the community. Notice he doesn't use the word disciples, which is the most common word for the followers of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels and in the Gospel of John as disciples. He never uses that title. But saints, following Paul, who refers to the members of the ecclesia as saints, holy ones. Apostles, although John never defines here what those mean, there's no sense of a 12 here, and prophets, which is to say that we saw them like the witnesses in chapter 11 called to be prophets. Not like we understand that in the formal sense of capital P prophets whose writings are in the Hebrew Scriptures, but all the followers of Jesus who are called to speak truth to power. It's on behalf of all of those people that God has given judgment for you against her. But the phrase is a little different here. Literally, God has judged your judgment, and that's what leads many scholars here to translate this differently, as God has rendered a verdict for you against her, or has given a sentence against her. Sentence seems to make sense here as sentence because that's what we see here. She's sentenced to become a desolation, and we see that from an older scholar suite there. So the play on words, though, following things that we've seen throughout this section where there's a lot of wordplay, and it's going to end with poetry that I'll show you in just a moment here. And then it, just as quickly as it went to rejoicing, it switches back. Now we're going to finally see the judgment, but strangely, although we saw in 14:8 and in beginning of 18, the aorist tense Babylon has fallen, or fallen is Babylon, now suddenly it reverts back to future tense. Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down and will be found no more, and we'll see that future tense throughout here, which is to say we can't really try to do this in terms of the language of tenses because God isn't subject to that. So from God's perspective, Babylon both exists and both is already gone because God's not limited by time. So although those on the ground certainly see Rome, and as I showed last time with the trade routes, Rome was only getting more powerful in the period following John's vision and the writing it down here. In the scheme of things, of course, Rome finally did fall, and so there's already a not yet element here of that, as well as the already not yet of the reign of God that we see in the Gospels in the other direction. So we see it goes both ways here. And then it shifts back to the strong angel, echoing the strong angel at the beginning of the chapter. That's part of the chiastic parallel, who took a stone like a great millstone. In case you're wondering, here's what one looks like. And it's a variation on Jeremiah 51, which you can see here. Notice here it says, when you finish reading the scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the middle of the Euphrates and say, thus shall sink Babylon to rise no more, because of the disasters I'm bringing on her. But as Sweet notes here, by adding like a great millstone and changing Euphrates to sea, John deepens the sign and widens its application. And that also connects back to the Ezekiel 26 passage. I didn't put that up on the right side of the screen, but it would be an even longer chart if I put every possible echo here. So as a symbolic action, the angel takes the stone like a great millstone, not actually a millstone, and throws it into the sea, and we won't worry ourselves about which side of the veil that's being portrayed on. Saying, with such violence, the word hormametai here is only here in the New Testament, and the Lolita lexicon helps us to hear that as sudden violence. And as Mounce notes, this stresses how suddenly and spectacularly the judgment of God will be executed. Simply another way of emphasizing the 1 hour and in 1 day that we've seen. With such sudden violence, the great city will be thrown down, ballisthai, which is to say the same word as an exorcism word, but it's a use, as Auni notes, of paranomasia here, the literal use followed by the figurative. So as the angel literally throws the stone like a millstone in the sea, Babylon will be thrown down and found no more. Which leads us to look at the poetic format of this, which I've laid out here, this refrain. And if we were to listen to it really slowly and a pause at the end of each one, we'd hear the refrain of that really played out. And of course, just to highlight as I go back, this is echoing against Jeremiah 25:10, which we see in great detail here. And we see every element of Jeremiah 25:10 is here. Here I'll put up the entire verse so you can see it in direct contrast here. So with that in mind, we look at the end of this, and we'll just focus on it here on the right side so we can see. The sound of harpists and minstrels, of flautists and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. So the sound of music and joy is silenced. An artisan of any trade will be found in you no more. And no sound is noted there, but there would be sounds of trade, whether those are blacksmiths or others. I will note a couple things about the language on the left side here. Technites and technes, another one of those where there's a wordplay, just as we saw with the throwing down and as we saw with the judgment. Here, the technites will no longer be using their technes, found no more. The light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And I guess I'm using more of this side than I was intending to, but we have notes in there that I don't have on the right side. And there's a wonderful irony here. The light of a lamp will shine in you no more. This is the only thing that's about visual, but not about hearing. But the irony here is there's no lamp in New Jerusalem other than the lamp of the Lamb. We're told no sun or moon because the light of the lamp will be the Lamb. So no lamp in New Jerusalem and no light of a lamp in fallen Babylon, but no lamb in Babylon either. So the light of a lamp will shine on you no more. The voice of a bridegroom and bride heard in you no more. Bridegroom and bride directly from Jeremiah 25:10. Bridegroom is a rare word in the New Testament, but bride will be common because New Jerusalem will be the bride, as we'll see, and God is the implied bridegroom there, tented in the street of the bride itself. A voice of the bridegroom and bride no more. If we look at all these together, we hear that all the things that make life in a city worth living. Notice there's nothing about nature there because there wasn't nature in the city. Nature is outside the city, so we don't hear about sheep or any of those things being silenced here, but just the things in the city. So no music, no revelry from marriage, no revelry from sound of trade. It's all gone. And the reason is your merchants were the great ones of the earth. The word for magnates here, megastantes, the great ones. We saw it only in 6:15 earlier where they were among the people who hid from the wrath of the angry Lamb. So it's a double irony because the merchants are like those who are afraid of the Lamb. But as we saw last time, a culture that makes merchants the great people is something that Rome would have mocked. As my note here says, the wealth of Rome transformed ordinary merchants, otherwise seen as low class, into VIPs. And all nations were deceived by your sorcery, and in you was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all who've been slaughtered on the earth. And that at the end leads to this surprise twist, which is to say Babylon is convicted of the very crimes that we saw were the function of the failure of the trumpets at the end of chapter 9. So let's go back and look at the last two verses of chapter 9 and hear how John is ironically implying here this particular set of charges of which Babylon is convicted. So we saw back there, the rest of humankind who are not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands or give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk, and they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their fornication or their theft. So as you note at the time, the connection between not repent is highlighting how the idolatry is the justification for the acts of empire, what I call there the four cardinal sins of empire, although as we noted a video or two ago, the word sin is not mentioned in any of those places. But this is what we're seeing. The murder is what's being named right now. In you is found the blood of prophets and saints. The sorcery is what's named right here, the propaganda that deceived them. Fornication, we saw earlier on that the kings have fornicated with Babylon. We saw that. And where's the theft? The theft was in all the economic wealth of the cargo that we saw listed all here, all described under the simple word theft, taken from all these places by exploitative means and slave labor. In other words, exactly what the quote that we saw last time from Cicero about merchants should not be honored is playing out here. That the problem with merchants is they were fraudulent and were thieves, and that's what's being named here. The entire Roman economy being condemned implicitly under the word one big act of theft. So Babylon has been judged by God, been found guilty of the four cardinal sins of empire, and has been sentenced to destruction and to death. And the saints and prophets and apostles are called to rejoice that God has finally rendered judgment for you against her. This is the end of Babylon, but it's not the end of the final judgment, because the beasts and the armies of the kings and the dragon are still out there, and that's where we'll go in chapter 19 and 20 next. See you then. Bye-bye.